Dear Governor Reeves, what's it like to be black and poor in Mississippi? We could have asked David May, 42, Bobby Vance, 54, James Brown, 54, Nora Ducksworth, 52, Lamorian Reeves, 28, Joshua Norman, 26, Jermaine Tyler, 38, A.D. Mills, 42, Denoris Howell, 36, Roosevelt Holloman, 32, Walter Gates, 25, Terrence Dobbins, 40, Graylin Cox, 62, Lee Clemmer Jr., 45, except now they are dead. These are 14 of the 24 deaths that occurred in the Mississippi Department of Corrections since December 26th. The remainder of the deceased were white or Hispanic. However, we could ask Mr. Theophilus Brown, 67, who has spent the past 44 years of his life in custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Mr. Brown was visiting Mississippi from his native Chicago in 1975, and in a state of youthful immaturity, he participated with 3 others in robbing a white man. He was unarmed. In this, his first offense, he was sentenced to life in prison in Mississippi. He did not have money for adequate legal representation in a state he was visiting in his early 20s. You see, this is what it's like to be both black and poor in Mississippi. I'm a native Mississippian, though I'm living in Maryland. I met Mr. Brown through my 30-year-old friend John, who's really more like family than a friend, who was sentenced to rehabilitation in the A&D rehab program in Leakesville in 2018. There was prevalent drug use in that facility, particularly spice, and this made finding reputable support among the gangs within the facility challenging for John. But toward the end of his 9-month stay there, he spoke often and highly of an older man named Brown, whom he affectionately called Uncle when we talked on the phone. Mr. Brown did not use drugs and encouraged John on his quest for sobriety. John said he was a kind and generous man who would always share any treat he may have with others. So just before John was released, I sent Mr. Brown a card acknowledging and thanking him for his positive influence on John's life. This began the unlikely correspondence between a middle-aged white woman and an incarcerated black man in his mid-60s. My first card to him was just before his birthday in 2019, so it's been exactly a year this month that we've been in communication. He can only mail a letter when he trades his meat with another inmate for a stamp or some sort of barter, which was regular when he was in Leakesville. He wrote weekly for most of 2019. The facility was on lockdown for at least 7 of those 12 months. And for the past 6 months, he wrote often of his anticipated parole review due at the beginning of February of this year. He sent me copies of the suggested certificates he's earned, anger management, alcohol and drug rehabilitation certificates, etc. However, just before the time came for his review this year, he was moved to Central Mississippi Correctional Facility to be near his oncologist. Mr. Brown was treated for prostate cancer several years ago, and from my understanding, needs new blood work. So since January, he was transferred from Leakesville to Rankin County, and more recently to Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman. And Mr. Brown has yet to meet the parole board. In his mid-60s, after having served 44 years in the Mississippi Department of Corrections, Mr. Brown still does not have money for adequate legal representation. This is what it's like to be black and poor in Mississippi. Today, on his 67th birthday, Mr. Brown called me from Parchman. Governor Reeves, yesterday, the day before he turned 67, he was moved abruptly from a relatively calm section of Parchman to an area that is more heavily controlled by gangs, Area 216 to Area 34. For the first time in a year of communicating, I heard fear and weakness in Brown's voice. Fear that he might get caught in the crossfire of gangs in Area 34, and weakness because he's dehydrated. They can't drink the water in Parchman. and the promised water bottles are no longer being provided. I don't have a law degree, Governor Reeves, but I do have a conscience, and I believe you do too. You proclaimed in your first State of the State address, "We will right the wrongs of the past, and we will do everything in our power to protect the dignity of every Mississippi life." You further exhibited some degree of conscience by vowing to close Unit 29. After bearing witness to the conditions at Parchman, I am asking you to please be a leader who is remembered for being on the just side of history. For the sake of the poor and the people of color, please do not forget your promises. No one claims this man or any other person incarcerated is innocent. But Equal Justice Initiative founder Brian Stevenson claims that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Mr. Brown has been incarcerated since you were just under 2 years old. All the years you have grown since about the time you learned to walk. These have been the same years he has spent living behind bars for a first-time, nonviolent offense. Yet in spite of all of this time he served, as a 67-year-old suffering from cancer, he gets moved into a gang-controlled area of Parchman in the midst of a 24 death count in 67 days. I hope and pray I do not go to my mailbox and receive a letter from Parchman with the words, "Return to sender, inmate deceased." In Hebrews, the scripture admonishes us to continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. I believe if the Bible teaches us anything, it teaches us to love the poor. Our attitude toward strangers in need reflects our attitude toward God. To do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Micah 6:8. To love the poor is to help the poor. To do justly is to help the poor. To love mercy is to help the poor. To walk humbly is to help the poor. So on behalf of the residents of the Mississippi Department of Corrections, I implore you to please continue to protect the dignity of every Mississippi life. Please help the poor and the historically disenfranchised, Governor Reeves. Please help the Mr. Browns, whose lives are literally at stake.